Hello one and all, Jasper here, and I've been wondering as of recently. Let's say that Viserys wasn't an idiot and took some actions to prevent the inevitable war that was obviously going to kick off after his death, with more than just telling both sides to kiss and make up. What if Viserys took a page out of his grandfather's book and held a great council to decide who should be the next king or queen of Westeros? What would happen? Well, unless good old Georgie boy comes out and says so himself, we won't ever know for sure. But I think there are some hints that we can take from the books to make a fairly reasonable assumption on who would win. Before we get into that, we probably should talk a little bit about what a great council is. Simply put, it's a gathering of many nobles throughout Westeros to discuss matters, debate, and hopefully solve a serious issue that the crown does not feel it can decide on its own. Though only used on matters of succession in lore, one can be called for any issue. Aenys the First considered calling a great council due to his indecisiveness and how to deal with a few small rebellions, but others acted and dealt with them, so no great council was needed. During a great council, any lord, regardless of status, is allowed to attend and vote regarding what action should be taken. In this case, choosing if either Rhaenyra Targaryen or Aegon Targaryen would sit on the Iron Throne after Viserys passed. As far as we are aware, every vote was equal regardless of status, so the minor lord who only had a glorified tower to call home would count just as much as the Warden of the North and current Lord of House Stark. So, with all of that laid out, how are we going to figure out who would win in this fictional political race? Well, for starters, why wasn't a great council called in the first place? The simple answer is that everyone was pretty confident that Rhaenyra would lose, even Rhaenyra herself. I recall partway into the war, Alicent floats the idea to Rhaenyra, who shoots it down. Westeros society having a strong preference for a male heir, on top of Rhaenyra not really being that great of a princess, who probably at best would have been a mediocre king, didn't help her, even if she was possibly slightly better than her half-brother. But is that the case? Because there are aspects to the war that make this a little more on the iffy side. For example, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that during the Dance of the Dragons, those that chose to fight and die for Rhaenyra would have likely voted for her as well. If we are to go by this logic, Rhaenyra would be the winner, as during the war, the North, Iron Islands, Vale, and majority of the Riverlands, and large parts of the Reach supported her. Aegon, by comparison, had the Crownlands, Stormlands, Westerlands, and the other half of the Reach. Heck, even a good chunk of those who did support him were strong-armed because they were originally blacks. Houses Butterwell, Rosby, and many others were all original supporters of Rhaenyra, but switched sides when Criston Cole showed up with an army and told them they had to change their mind. Now, some of you might think perhaps population should be taken into account. The North and Islands are some of the least populated areas, and the show had that one dumb line where the population of just King's Landing was greater than that of the North. Maybe a higher population can imply that more nobles can cast their vote, or that there's more nobility in general, kind of like our electoral system in the US. Or maybe, due to the vast size of, for example, the North, maybe to minimize issues of distant communication, they have more nobles. Texas and Alaska would love that reasoning. I wish we had an idea of how many votes were cast in the previous Great Council that saw Viserys named heir over Rhaenys in the show and Laenor in the books. But all we know is more than 1,000 showed up, and Viserys won with 20-1 odds, allegedly. Here is what I did, and it isn't perfect, but I did lazily look up how many noble houses are mentioned in each region, and this is what I got. Keep in mind, some houses like the Mudds were mentioned despite being extinct by this time, and others like the Manderleys and Blackwoods were counted twice because they'd both been noble houses in two different regions. But it shouldn't shake things up too much. The Reach has the most at 76. Hey, maybe our theory of population could be accurate. Next is the North at 74. Well, so much for that theory. The River and Westerlands tie for third place at 57. Next is the Crownlands at 55. The Stormlands and Vale tie at 42. The Iron Islands has 39. And even though they don't really matter in this war, for fun, Dorne brings up the rear at 29 houses. That's a total of 441, which isn't even half. Now, The amount of lords in Westeros is obviously never stated, but estimates that I found say 1,080. They justify this by taking the 9 main houses and multiplying that by 12, as it seems each has about a dozen vassals that serve under them directly, and multiply that number by, let's say 10, as it seems the amount of vassals they can have range from 3 all the way up to 12. There's a few problems with this, however. First off, I don't think any of the major houses have less than 12 vassals. Most of the numbers I mentioned previously are listed as being direct vassals to the main families, like the Starks and Lannisters. It's the minority that are listed as serving under smaller lords, like House Forrester, who serves under House Glover, or House Charlton, who serves under House Frey. I think the truth is, we have no clue, and it's actually a fuck ton, and George also has no idea. Doing some kind of lazy historical research googling, I found this. England, at roughly the same time period as Westeros is set in, had 150 to 200 families that held a significant amount of land and influence, with possibly 10,000 more under them. Though this includes stuff like knights, so take that 10,000 with a grain of salt. Keep in mind though, this is England, not even Great Britain, just England. And already it seems like half of this island has 10 times the population of all of Westeros with these numbers, at least in regards to the noble population. France and Poland had comparable numbers, so realistically speaking, it shouldn't have been just over 1,000 lords who attended the Great Council. If we assume that on average each region had 5,000 families and cut Dorne, that would be a possibility of 40,000 families, which means if only 1,000 showed up for the Great Council, that's, a little bit over 2%. Getting off topic though, because the truth is the amount of families doesn't matter too much. But for the sake of sticking to what we know is true, let's assume that the estimated 1,080 families is accurate. If we were to just use these numbers and base them on how the war support is at the start, then Rhaenyra could have had as many as 680 votes in her favor, while Aegon would have had 400, meaning she would have about 63% of the votes. Now, the US has technically had much bigger landslide victories if we compare it to our electoral college. In fact, there have been 34 presidential elections out of 59 who won by larger margins of victory. But if we judged it based on a more population basis, then it becomes much more impressive, as the US has only had 6 presidential elections where someone won more than 63% of the popular vote. 2 of them are George Washington, who went unopposed. One of them was James Monroe, who ran unopposed on his second term, so they don't really count, meaning only 3 elections have a larger margin than this scenario. And in case you're wondering, it's the 1804, 1808, and the 1816 election. The loser of the 1804 and 1808 election was the same guy, Charles Cotworth, who thought running him a second time was a good idea. Good God. Dude holds the gold and bronze in the biggest loser with 27.2% support and 32.4%. But at least he doesn't have the silver, which goes to Rufus King, who won 30.9% of the popular vote. Though Rufus might be a bigger loser than you think, as he was the vice president to Charles Cotworth when he ran and lost those 2 previous terms. Getting distracted by American history. Back to House of the Dragon and fuck! You know what I just realized? What the fuck is a lord? My first thought is it's someone in charge of a plot of land, but what if they have brothers and sisters? Tyrion was addressed as lord several times, but is that just a courtesy, or would he also get a vote if a council was held? Fuck me, would the phrase have the most sway simply because there are so many of the fuckers? Hell, there are some knights who hold more land and influence than lords. Could they vote? This is getting more complicated. I'm going to put my foot down and say knights don't get a vote, and only the heads of a family get to vote. Now with that laid out, is there any path Aegon has to snatch victory in this practically insurmountable odds? Well, there could be one way, and it's that houses that might not have supported him in the war would vote for him because there's no risk of violent retaliation. Think of it like how a liberal in Wyoming or a conservative in Massachusetts. You're going to be less likely to show your support for your beliefs because of how unpopular it is where you live. But when voting comes, you'll probably stand by those principles you hold. But could Aegon steal 7% of the vote, giving him a very marginal victory? Well, that seems more than doable than what one might expect. Using the most recent election as an example, Kamala Harris won 26% in her worst performing state, and Trump won 32% in his worst performing state. So it's perfectly reasonable that Aegon could have 7% support from the regions that declared for Rhaenyra during the dance. But it's only natural to assume that since Aegon can take votes, then so could Rhaenyra. And if the gap of the votes she takes away is enough to keep Aegon from reaching that 7% gap, then she wins. Now, using Trump and Kamala as examples would mean that Rhaenyra would win, as the difference between their worst performing states is 6%. But let's be real here, I think no matter how sexist you think the US is, can we agree that Westeros is more sexist? Funnily enough though, I think Trump's 32% is too high for Aegon as well. That's almost 1/3 of the total vote, and I'm sorry, but I think if Aegon had that much support in these regions that supported Rhaenyra, then we would have seen some of them break off and choose to support her. So both have to be less. So once again, using American politics, because that's all I really know or care about, and going back to the most one-sided presidential election in US history, Charles Cotsworth's worst performing states was at about, oh my god, 0.14%. Anyways, if we give Rhaenyra that much support in Aegon's territory and give Aegon 7.14% or even more, then it could work and still justifies why the regions that supported either one of them didn't explode to be more confrontational like the Reach did. But 0.14% is just so mean. I think you could put Aegon the Unworthy or Aerys the Mad in a presidential race against Jaehaerys, and they would get more support than that. Let's give Rhaenyra 5% and assume Aegon has at least 12%. Now, am I confident at all in these numbers I gave you? Fuck no. It honestly looks like a mess when I step back and look at it, but luckily, I do have another scenario just in case this is all bullshit. The Iron Islands. Considering the reason Dalton Greyjoy chose to assist the Blacks was because Rhaenyra gave him permission to raid and pillage to his heart's content so long as it was her enemies. And who was an enemy? The rich western lands, which were very close and vulnerable. Get rid of that tantalizing option, and I could see almost all of the Iron Islands switching side to vote for Aegon, assuming they even bothered to show up to the Great Council. They're also the least populated of the region, and they were the ones with the least noble houses mentioned, so it's honestly debatable whether every single Ironborn family were to support Aegon if that would be enough. I think it could be, but it would still be close. Ah shit, another thing I realized is, when does the Great Council take place? I kind of just assumed it would be right after Viserys' death, but realistically speaking, it would have to be while he was alive. And so if he calls the Great Council, and obviously gives his support to Rhaenyra, who knows how many more people are going to vote for Rhaenyra in that case, making it even more difficult for Aegon to overcome her. Granted, the voting was in secret, so Viserys wouldn't know who voted against his wishes, but let's be real, are you gonna risk that? What's stopping Viserys from snapping his fingers and finding out who voted against his daughter? It's hard to say, but like I said, we'll never get a straight answer unless George was to make one himself. But hey, that's my general thoughts about it. If you like this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss my next one. And until then, be safe and have a wonderful night.